My goodness. I'll ask Dudley if he would like to come up here and start his presentation. No, it's not fixed.
Well, hello everybody. Can you hear me all right? At the back? Good. I thought I'd just let you know that during one of the conferences I went to in England, in front of the platform over here, they had the old X-Files slogan, you know, the famous one, "The truth is out there." So one of the lecturers, he started off the whole thing by walking up and saying, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, if the truth is out there, what are you lot doing sitting in here then? You know, I mean, if you really want to know what's going on." But no, we're glad you came. We're glad you came because the ticket money does help to run these conferences and lead to bigger and better things. And we're just going to suggest that next time you come, if you bring along one open-minded skeptic, it could be more interesting for him as well. And the more people that come, the easier the task is to get the truth out, if you like. So people wouldn't have to keep pointing out that the truth is out there. They'd all know it. So, yeah, okay. As you can imagine, these sort of 7 international conferences I attended, they actually covered 50 speakers, an average of 2 hours per lecture. So we're looking at trying to get some information out on 100 hours of lectures by the world's top researchers in this business. So my job was not to sort of tell you all the wonderful, interesting things that I could remember and write down, because that would go on, you know, all night long. My job is a hard one, just to pick out in half an hour. So the best that I heard, the ones that impressed me, and I hope that it would sort of cause your minds to expand a bit too, because unless you go to some of these conferences, you know, it's always in the background, UFOs, but when you've actually heard it firsthand from some of the experts who've been there and interviewed the people and have participated in examining ground traces and all the rest of it, it really comes home hard to you. And I would certainly recommend going to some of the international ones coming up in Australia. A tremendous one in Brisbane in October, that you should try and get to. You'll be a changed person after that. You'll know a heck of a lot more about UFOs. Okay, so I'll start off with the one I went to in last October, first in Hawaii. Some of the people there were 8 good speakers. I've got to pick out 2 or 3. I'll just start off with Wendell Stevens. He's a retired military officer, and he boasts of the largest collection of UFO photographs in the world. Certainly a private collection that would be among the biggest. And he showed some of the best ones in the 1990s, things like stealth fighters and B-1 and B-2 bombers chasing UFOs. And these are very spectacular photos. They were filmed in Florida. And he also went on to tell a little bit about the case I'll tell you about now. He mentioned the start of a very interesting abduction case from Ecuador, the sort of jungle area of Ecuador. And it was elaborated on more about 3 months later at the conference in Nevada. Basically, the facts were that an Indian couple living in a village, just like any other villager there, they're a very rural part, and they don't have any schools over there, no TV, no radio stations, no books, no shops. They live a very simple life. They grow their own food and come back home in the evening and eat it and rest and do the same thing the next day. So apparently what happened one day was this couple coming home from the fields doing their daily work were confronted by, or at least just the man this time, he was alone, his wife had known a bit earlier. He saw a landed disc, you know, classic disc, and one of these funny grey entities step out of it and tell him telepathically that they wanted him to participate with his wife in producing a hybrid child, an alien child, and they were going to do it, not to worry about it, they'd arrange it all. And they said to tell his wife if she'd be willing to participate and to create a hybrid child, an alien child. And he laughed at it and said, no, I don't think she'd agree and everything, but they said, don't worry about it, but when the time comes in 2 weeks, she'll agree, you'll find this out yourself. So he went home and told his wife, she laughed, you know, out loud and said, I don't even want to have any more children with terrestrial humans, let alone with alien beings, you know, so please leave me alone, sort of thing. And the word went around the village, and the story got out a little bit. It eventually reached Brazil. But what happened during those next 2 weeks was the fact that his wife did start to talk more about it. There was some sort of alien mental conditioning process going on, and she was beginning to accept the idea that it would be something useful for her to do, And she was sort of looking forward to the experience. And a couple of weeks later, sure enough, they were coming home both together. This landed, this came down. The entity got out and invited them aboard. Now, why this case is interesting, especially to me, is it's the first one I've heard where the whole thing was happening at our conscious level. It was happening in our own real three-dimensional reality, not at a higher dimension or subconsciously under hypnosis or anything. This was a living case happening in real time. So apparently they went aboard the craft. The husband saw there were 3 other women on other tables inside this disc. They were undergoing the same sort of artificial insemination operation. And his wife was led to the table, and she was laid down, and some sort of liquid was injected into her, and you have to surmise that it was some sort of alien sperm or whatever you like to call it. And she was told that, yes, she's now pregnant, and don't worry about it, because in 3 months they'll come back out and remove the fetus and develop it in their own way. So they left, and word got around to the Brazilian ufologists, and sure enough, 3 months later, coming back home, to cut a long story short, the thing, came down again, and they were invited aboard the craft, which they went willingly, and they did the operation. They removed the fetus, which looked just like the ones that have been described by many abductees around the world under hypnosis. They said they saw a sort of a human-looking child, but it had a pear-shaped face and very large sloping eyes, and a long neck, and different a little bit to a normal human baby, but it was still, recognizable as some sort of humanoid creature. And it was put in some sort of an artificial womb with colored liquids bubbling through it and everything, and they sort of said, thank you very much, and they, led them out back to their village. So I just mentioned that because if people start saying, abductions are just imaginary, it only happens in the mind and everything, maybe it does a lot of the time or some of the time, but there are cases going on which are real. And this case definitely proves that abductions are real. It happens the way people have described under hypnosis. In those cases, the aliens obviously purposely try to get the people to forget to avoid trauma, but they're going on with some agenda of their own, which we don't fully understand, but we can surmise and guess that they're trying to create some sort of human or humanoid race to take over possibly what happens to the Earth after natural disasters happen, or, those sort of things, but that's speculation. I'll go over now to Dr. Richard Borland's account. He's actually an abduction therapist now, but he gets a lot of information from friends of his and intelligence agencies, and they leaked a lot of information to him. And they pointed out to him that the Hubble Space Telescope has been photographing some very unusual objects in the asteroid belt. They're unusual because they don't follow the typical planetary laws of motion under, and sort of discovered by Newton, and we can see witnessed, in every sort of orbiting body around the Earth or the solar system in general. These things slow up, speed up, change direction a bit. In other words, they're not asteroids. And some of these things are pretty large, and they're going about their business there unseen to most people on Earth. And they're hard to pick up because they have a tendency to hide, according to the NASA spokesman that leaked this information out to him. One thing that was really scary, and it was so scary that the Defense Department put a clamp on it for about 15 years, was that the Voyager 1 space probe in 1981, when it was photographing planets, the outer giant planets on its way out to the outer edges of the solar system, photographed some objects that were 7,000 miles long, in other words, the size of the Earth in length, and about 400 miles in diameter. And these things were moving around in orbit around the planet Saturn, and they would change direction and speed, and they would come and go like ships at a harbor, apparently, that's what he was told. And they seemed to be maneuvering in and out of the rings of Saturn, and they were doing things to the rings. They seemed to be like mining it or creating it or in some way manipulating it. And these things were there, and when they were picked up by the Voyager 1 space probe, the Defense Department has a great hold on NASA. Anything coming, that suggests extraterrestrial creations or life of any kind is automatically suppressed under recommendations of the Brookings Institution report about 1961, where they recommended any sign of intelligent life outside must be suppressed because they didn't want to create the usual world panic, as they thought, and upset the world's religions and so on. So this thing was kept quiet by the Defense Department for a long time until it was leaked out to an author who put it out in a book called something, The Ringmakers of Saturn. So there we are. There's some weird things going on out there which most people don't know about if they're just watching TV and the usual soap operas. Dr. Richard Sauter next. I'll tell you a bit about him. I saw him in Nevada. I had dinner with him. He's the author of Underground Bases and Tunnels, and he's dug up documents by the U.S. Army, etc., which prove that there are huge machines which they've given tenders for, which they've constructed, things that can, 100 feet in diameter, that can dig out the tunnel at the rate of 100 foot an hour. And there are some smaller machines that can do even faster. But these ones, they might be apparently nuclear-powered tip. Now, there's a nuclear reactor in the front, and this goes in the front, and it just melts the rock and turns it into lava. And there's something like a vacuum cleaner behind it, which just sucks out the molten lava and blows out the back of them, and they keep boring in. It's like a hot soldering iron going through butter. And they've created tunnels all over the United States. There are almost underground cities there. They go down 40 stories deep sometimes, and who knows what the heck they're doing down there. Speculation ranges from genetic research to advanced propulsion systems. There's some sort of alien cooperation with the government. There are sort of people living over there and operating things that only they seem to know about. This has sort of been leaking out by employees of the area and security guards who've decided to, blow the story and commit suicide and all the rest of it. And one on this subject, I thought I'd just mention that there was one guy called Phil Schneider who actually worked on these tunnels, and he was part of a so-called shootout, he says, between aliens and U.S. military forces in 1979, when some misunderstanding got out of hand, and there was literally a fight between the alien groups over there and the American military personnel. And he escaped just by sheer good luck, and a lot of his comrades were killed, and a lot of aliens were killed, and there was a big sort of conference between the alien and human beings who were running that place, according to him. When he told the story, and some others, about the construction of these bases, they used very small nuclear-powered devices to create holes and tunnels all over the southwestern part of the U.S. He was told not to do it repeatedly. Over a number of years, he was giving this information out in public, and he just kept on. There were 13 attempts on his life. He was very lucky to survive all these things, like tampering with his car's brakes and all sorts of things like that to make it look like an accident and suicide. Like many scientists who worked for the Marconi Company in England that suffered mysterious suicides in the same way. And apparently, eventually they got to him, or whoever it was that did, because on 11th of January 1996, they found him dead with piano wire wrapped around his neck, because he's one of the chief whistleblowers in what's going on at these bases. The one he was involved in at Dulce in New Mexico was the one he had the shootout with it, apparently. I'll mention now Professor A.J. Gevard of Brazil. He's been over here, and he lectured in Hawaii and America and everything. He's probably one of the top ufologists in Brazil, and he presented the story of the latest goings-on with regard to the UFO crash in a place called Varginha, which is about 100 miles north of the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, which happened on 20th of January 96. The Americans were the first to see it on the deep space radar, and they saw it going down. It seemed to be going down to crash into Sao Paulo. And they thought, oh my God, we better warn those people. And they told the Brazilian government that they'd see the thing going down, and to get ready, they were warming up the engines of the C-5A Galaxy transports heading down to Brazil, and there was all hell breaking loose in the Brazilian high command over there. Apparently the thing did come down, it veered at the last minute, it changed direction, it crashed at this little town called Varginha. And to shorten the story, a number of weird-looking little alien creatures with little ribbed horns on their heads with browny skin were actually captured over a period of a few days, some within a couple of hours of the thing crash landing. They were witnessed by some teenage girls and then more and more people. The fire department were the initial people to capture one because they were first on the scene, and then they transferred the whole operation to the Brazilian military, and they actually captured a lot more, took one or two of the dead ones to the local hospitals, and there were autopsies done, and the results of those were, and the leftover remains were flown back on the C-5A transports back to the United States. This is an ongoing case. There are many witnesses to it, military witnesses and so on. Some of them have gone underground because they've been threatened. The Brazilian military are clamping down on the case, or trying to. One fellow went on TV and he was threatened with his life after his TV version of his events, of how he took part in some of the capture of these things. And he apparently is living in isolation in some farm, hiding from what he believes is someone that's going to do away with him. So it's all been happening in Brazil and South America. And Graham Birdsall, well, he's the editor of UFO magazine in England, and he gave a number of lectures in Hawaii and in America too. I won't preempt what he's saying because it's covered much more in detail by his boss, if you like, called Anthony Dodd. He's the director of Quest International in England, a large research organization there. But Graham Birdsall has been receiving reports of 500 large black flying triangles in Britain every month. They're getting reports of these unusual type of UFOs, and some of them are literally 700 feet long, apparently. They're triangular craft. That's what distinguishes them from many of the other ones. They're giant in size. They're usually at least as small as a football field in length. They have a habit of hovering over freeways, frightening motorists to death. And that's why we're getting a lot of witnesses. And when they land near farms and in the countryside, which is where they tend to operate most of the time, they don't fly over major cities. They have very, very powerful lights on them at their corners. And if you're directly underneath them, and some people have been literally only 100 feet or so away from them, they have a tendency to cause a mild sunburn because people wake up the next day and they've been burned. Their face and hands are very red, as though they've been in the sun all day in a tropical country. So those are pretty interesting devices. They're large and they're about in large numbers. They're certainly all over Britain and north of Britain into the North Atlantic, and I'll tell you more about that when Tony Dodd's lecture is revived over here. One of the cases, these large flying triangles, which is interesting to mention, is that in Scotland in September last year, two women driving home with their children from a party or something, they noticed that one of these large craft hovering not far away from them, but 100 yards away. It came down and landed, and they were curious because this was a really unusual sight. They had brilliant light coming from it and so forth. So they got out to take a look, which is probably a mistake they made because while they were watching it, apparently 100 little grey humanoid aliens popped out of the thing, and they somehow got into, and they were walking about underneath it, and while these women were looking sharp, these aliens sort of turned into a ball of light, a cocoon, which came at them, floated towards them, in en masse. And the women were so scared because just within a few feet from them, these sort of aliens popped out of these cocoons of light, and they were surrounded by these little grey humanoid creatures. And they said that they must have been so scared that they literally blacked out. What happened was that they certainly blacked out, whether it was done through fright or whether it was done by alien interaction. We don't know, we can surmise, but it turns out that they were abducted and they had on a hypnosis, they relived the capture. And they were taken aboard this craft. There were literally dozens of these greys walking about, doing various things. And they had the usual sort of medical experiments performed on them. And then they were let out. But they noticed that in command of these greys, it seemed as though there was one supervisor that was sort of supervising all this activity. And he was a tall fellow, and he looked like a giant insect. He's one of the insect types, the insectoids. And this is interesting because usually they tend to be of one type seen together, but there is evidence now that there are some different types, the reptilians or something, which interact with the other ones. And there's some speculation that the little greys are just biological androids, and they're just sort of like robots that do all the work, and the big ones just supervise and monitor the robotic activity under some plan. And these people, the women, they were so frightened when they learned the details under hypnosis that the effect it had on them was quite dramatic. They sold their property there, frightened of being recaptured, because they'd heard that this thing happens periodically. And they sold their house there and they moved to South Wales in Britain, which is almost the equivalent of somebody being scared in Sydney and selling their home here and moving to Perth or Darwin or somewhere. So Britain is inundated with black flying triangles, and there's even more out there in the North Atlantic, which I'll get to. Come to a fellow called Giorgio Bongiovanni. He's an Italian fellow from Sicily, and he came to fame in about 1992 when he claimed an entity which a lot of people interpret as being the Holy Mother, Mother of Jesus, and because she looked like that, going to him, had a halo on her head, and she gave him some messages, which in the Italian translation was long, and I didn't get all of it, but you can imagine the things she might have said, warning us about the coming times. And to prove to him and to the people he was going to talk to about it that she was really there, he said some beams of light came from her eyes onto his forehead, and he started to bleed immediately. And he's got a big red scar over there today. And the interesting thing about this wound is that it's ongoing. In other words, it bleeds every day with his blood, and doctors are baffled as to the cause of why this happens, and they just know it does. And they checked him over. He's quite normal. He bleeds from the forehead, and he heals up by itself. And he's got this huge sort of big red mark over there. And fortunately, he's coming to Australia in October at the Brisbane conference there, and he'll probably be quite a draw card. He was very interesting there. He's had audiences with the Pope, Gorbachev, Clinton, a number of astronauts, generals, etc., who've been fascinated by the story. And that was just the start of it, because 2 years later, the lady came back again, Holy Mother, Mary, whatever it is, the entity, and she gave him some more information, and this time the rays from her eyes just beamed down to his hands, and he was stigmatized on his hands, and he's got permanent blood stains over there, and they bleed too every day, and they heal up, and the doctors are just as baffled as before. And this carried on, and he went and lectured to people all over Africa, thousands of people, and 2 years later, I think it was about 1995, she came back again with some more information, and the rays of light from her eyes came down to his feet. Boom, and he's got blood stains on his feet, and he bleeds from his feet every day. So this is ongoing. We don't know if it's going to happen again, but he's willing to show it all around the world. Doctors have examined him. He's a great puzzle, and he's coming to Brisbane in October. That's Giorgio Bongiovanni. The same sort of thing happens to other people. Some women there in that area too. They've experienced the same things, but they get blood stains they bleed from the eyes, and their blood runs from their eyes, and they've got large blood stains on their cheeks, permanent ones, permanently scarred. The same thing happens to them. They cry rivers of blood every day, and it heals up. Something interesting going on there. If we're talking about entities, if that's part of the UFO phenomena, well, that's all part of it too, and that's why he was there at the Nevada conference. I'd like to mention Jorge Martins. He's a journalist from Puerto Rico, where he spent a lot of his time. And the things that are going on over there are really amazing. I mean, it's even more amazing than the fact that Mexico has been inundated with UFOs for the last 5 years. Almost every day people come home from work and film them with their camcorders in the evening before they have their evening meal. What's going on there generally now is being eclipsed by what's happening in Ecuador. They're having more UFO sightings per square miles or square kilometer, whatever you like to call it, per head of population than any other country on Earth at present. Ecuador is swamped with UFOs. So if you want to see one, just get a plane over there and hop off, and within 24 hours you're going to see some. That's what's been happening to investigators who go over there. And there's been some dramatic film from over there too. It rivals and even surpasses the stuff that's coming out from Mexico, which some people have seen on the videos produced on that event. So Jorge Martin in Puerto Rico is investigating a whole host of phenomena. A fairly recent one, a thing called the little animal or weird entity, sort of half. It looks to be something like a kangaroo with a devilish face and with a lot of ribbed skeleton bone at the back of its spine. In other words, it looks like a bit of a flying dinosaur, the old pterodactyls, and that. It's a version of that with feet. And it sort of preys on, it's a very intelligent, smart animal apparently. It even reports that it can telepathically communicate with human beings. And it's often seen a few hours after UFOs have been seen in the area, so there's some people are linking it to that. The thing about it is that it does attack goats and small domestic animals like dogs and cats and fowl and everything, and that's why the neighbors got involved, because they were scared. I mean, they were losing animals and they thought maybe they're going to attack us next. But so far as you can tell, they haven't attacked any human beings in that manner. And but they're interesting, they're about, and now some have been seen now in Mexico and further south. That's an ongoing new problem. Every few years we get new things happening, crop circles, these weird animals, grey entities. And in the midst of all this, with chupacabras, whatever they call them, they're now sighting little grey humanoids all around the place, especially at night time, from little dark alleyways and things. They just pop out of nowhere and they frighten people. And the people that live in the areas have even seen whole areas of the earth, like a giant if you can imagine a giant manhole cover that's been camouflaged with earth and grass on top of it, so you don't even know it's there. Then all of a sudden you're walking along or driving along, coming back cross country walk or something, and this whole giant manhole cover, about 20 feet or more in diameter, suddenly opens up in front of you, and these grey alien humanoids pop up. Even more alarming, they see what appear to be something like US Navy personnel accompanying some of them. So the poor people, they're very confused. They don't know who to report this to. When they report it to the military say, what are you talking about? We don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing like that. We don't have anything over here. And these UFOs have been seen to dive in and out of the water in the big lake called Lake Cartagena or something over there. And there's a vast US naval presence all around the area there. There's a base over there. And there are plenty of aircraft carriers whizzing around, the whole island, keeping a check on what's going on or participating in what's going on. We don't know for sure. What is interesting is that a few years ago, he did mention this again in the conferences, 2 US Navy Tomcats were chasing a UFO with some people on the ground. There were 200 witnesses. They watched this thing appear in the sky with a UFO, and they saw 2 Tomcat jets from the local aircraft carrier parked nearby chase this thing, and they were converging on it, and they were seen on radar, and the thing was seen to merge with the UFO. As soon as it merged with the UFO, it just hung around for a while, and the whole thing disappeared in a flash. And 2 jets did this, and they've never seen the planes or the pilots again. They literally vanished in midair with this UFO when they merged together. The interesting thing was that the people, they heard the jet engines roar as the thing roared towards the UFO, and when it met the UFO, there was a sudden silence. There was no sound of explosions or anything like that, no obvious disintegration of the plane. They just vanished in the UFO, and then the UFO took off and it vanished. This happened in 1988 or 89, and then 2-3 years later, the same thing happened again. The US Navy lost 4 Tomcat jets with crewmen aboard, and presumably all the pilots' wives were all paid off pensions and things and told their husbands were lost in exercises and accidents and crashes or something. They didn't say exactly how and why. So that's another interesting thing that you won't read in the papers generally, because newspapers are under things called D notices, defense notices. Anything of this nature is automatically stopped at the highest level. So that's why we don't read UFO incidents that are happening all over the world, and even in our own country here, to the extent that the actual event is happening. I think most people are aware of this fact, and that's why people are capitalizing on this in programs like the X-File and Dark Skies, having to point out the fact that governments are suppressing this information, and they're building entertainment stories around these sort of true events. So, as I say, it's hard to know what to leave out, because I could go on for hours and hours, but I thought I'd just mention that this sort of bit about aircraft disappearances is not the first time it's happened. The first case that came to public attention via the books of Major Donald Kehoe, and has since been confirmed by documents by the Canadian government have issued, showing that one of their jets at that time, I think it was called an F-94 Starfire jet of that era, 1953, 23rd November, it was vectored in towards a UFO hovering over Lake Superior between the US and Canadian border. It chased it. Somehow the UFO flew back and merged with the jet, and on radar everyone was puzzled to see that the whole blip disappeared. And for days and days they searched for traces of wreckage and everything. There was no wreckage, nothing, no trace of the plane and its crew of 2, the radar observer aboard, the navigator, and the pilot. Another interesting case came from England, where in the East Coast the same sort of thing happened. They sent, in that era, I think it was the early 80s, a Lightning jet fighter at the time was sent to investigate this UFO, and the thing was flying along, and the UFO was seen to merge with the jet. And this one didn't disappear entirely quickly. It somehow reappeared. He was lucky for a little while anyway, because what happened was that when he came out of the UFO, the control people said, do not bring the aircraft into land, do not bring it into ground, ditch it in the sea, and bail out. And that was the orders they gave him. For some reason they feared some sort of contamination, or they must have known something about it, that they didn't want the aircraft to land back on British soil. So the pilot apparently went along with this request, and the aircraft was seen to dive into the sea, to be recovered a couple of days later, because it was fairly shallow water, only 100 feet deep or something, and they recovered the aircraft, and they found the pilot wasn't there. They lost the pilot. But the interesting thing was that the canopy was firmly shut. In other words, he didn't eject in the normal way. Normally the canopy is blown off and, he goes up with the little rocket motor under his seat. So, in other words, they abducted him from his jet straight through the cockpit. Didn't need to open the cockpit. And the plane was recovered and taken away, never to be seen again by, civilians. The military have that thing. I meant to talk a little bit about Don Schmidt. He's one of the principal investigators of the Roswell crash. And this is a thing which has been going on since 1947. There are still living witnesses to this, getting very old. And there's been a race against time to try and get hold of more of their testimony before they pass on. So Don Schmidt, he's been back and forth from his home in the northern part of the U.S., Philadelphia, I think he's lived now, back to Roswell and back 7 times last year, chasing up leads and witnesses at his own expense, of course. And this is an ongoing case. They're finding more witnesses to that event. And I thought I'd just mention him because the other major investigator of the whole Roswell incident, Stanton Friedman, who's studied the whole thing for the last, since the late 70s, he was the first to realize there was a real story of it. Before it was just conjecture. And he got into it in 1978. And he's made a lot of investigations on this crash, and he's one of the principal investigators. And he concluded that there were 2 UFOs which collided, and one skipped off a couple of 100 miles to the west and crashed at a place called Corona, and the other one landed 75 miles north of the Roswell, the town, the base over there, onto this large ranch, which was not owned by, but the foreman over there, Mac Brazel, came to fame, and he was the one that found bits of wreckage over there and brought it back to the sheriff, and then the sheriff related it back to the local army base, the Air Force base there. And that's how the story got involved. I won't go into all the details because I'm sure a lot of people know some of those already about the famous Roswell event. But I just mentioned Don Schmidt because his major point of contention was he didn't want to believe one of the witnesses of Stanton Friedman dug up, which said that this fellow witnessed coming across dead alien bodies and wreckage at this place called Corona shortly before U.S. military personnel came aboard and hounded a lot of the civilian people who got there by mistake, a big team of archaeologists, and shunted them away in trucks, and the military took over and scooped up the wreckage and alien bodies, etc. But apparently this witness claimed he saw one living entity on the ground and later died, and some dead bodies around. This was in addition to the supposed dead bodies that people saw coming back from the crash site at the ranch, which was the foreman there was Mac Brazel. People who saw these things come back in crates and put aboard aircraft and flown away. So the Roswell thing is still ongoing. It's a bit like the case in Brazil, and Professor Gevard, and I tend to agree with him, would suggest that the case in Brazil is probably even more important than Roswell because we have so many hundreds of living witnesses to this event, and they're still being tracked down, and bits and pieces of the story are coming together. So that's a pretty big thing. Now in England, I think, to me, the most sort of worrying things here, and he's put out a marvelous video on it, and you can see most of the details of that in detail at the Ashfield conference coming up in a month from now, because I won't have time to go into all of that, but I can tell you some of it, and you can tell your friends to come along and see the real video and fill in all the other bits. But the North Atlantic has been plagued with UFOs, ongoing now for at least 5 years in great intensity. It's been going on for 20 years, but in the last 5 years, things have been happening over there, especially with the Icelandic Airways planes that fly from Iceland to Britain, and some of the other British planes and international American ones that fly to North America via that route. They go over Scotland, over Iceland, Greenland, over northern Canada, and come down over Montana and down to Los Angeles on that route. Between Scotland and Iceland, about 7 a week are reported of these giant black flying triangles, which not only pace the planes, and sometimes they cause the pilots to take violent evasive maneuvers to, they think there's going to be a collision or something, and they're passenger planes, and sometimes the stewardesses and people have been thrown about a little bit in this thing, and drinks and food have flown all over the place, and they've been explained away as something else, like turbulence or something, but they were deliberate maneuvers to avoid things that were flying around there, interfering with the normal passage of those aircraft. 7 a week. How many do you get to read about in the newspapers? Do you think they're covering it up? The other interesting thing about these black flying triangles is they're not only just masters of the air, they act like submarines too. When they want to hide, instead of going up, they sometimes dive down into the sea. And they do it without creating a splash or any kind of disturbance. They just sort of go in like a knife through butter, and they're out of sight. When this thing was reported, a lot of the NATO exercises that were going on at the time became very acutely aware of this, because they were disrupting all the planned, NATO exercises that go on a routine basis. Over here we have Operation Kangaroo once a year, where the forces land on the northern Queensland, and all the Navy and Air Force get together and they play war games. Well, over there they play war games with a number of nations. There's NATO, Norway and Holland, France and Britain and all the rest of it, and the Americans. They've got large fleets over there. And while these exercises are going on, these things come down and confuse everybody. There are orbs flying about the aircraft carriers over the ships, and down into the water they go, and they're tracked by special ships traveling at over 300 knots. That's something like 500 kilometers per hour underwater. So it actually causes consternation among the military planners over there. And they try to keep this under wraps, but there are enough people aboard these ships to see it and witness it, and they talk to friends and family, and it sort of leaks out. And there are a lot of leaks over this. And Tony Dodd, his life was threatened when he was talking about it in America 2 years ago. He was not supposed to mention one particular incident, but he went ahead anyway, because he said, look, I fought against you guys, in the last World War, and I don't sort of submit to Nazi tactics easily. So, like, heck with you, and he sort of went ahead with it. He's still talking about it today, but I hope he doesn't suffer the same fate as Phil Schneider, because Schneider kept at it until they did away with him, or someone did. But what he reported was the fact that during one of these encounters with these black flying triangles on the water, a destroyer, I think it was at the time, gave orders for the rest of the fleet to stay 3 kilometers or 3 miles away, give them a break, and they were going to chase this thing that was underwater. They could track it. It was whizzing about underneath, confusing all the submarine war games and everything. So this thing headed out after this over the horizon, and they saw the ship go over the horizon, and they tried to call it back and try to communicate with it. Nothing. They went over there and had a look later on. Nothing. The whole thing had disappeared completely off the face of the earth. There was no wreckage, no flotasm, no crew. 45-man crew gone. That was in early 1993. Since then, there have been 2 other incidents where capital ships have simply disappeared, chasing around with these things over there with their crew. If I was an admiral, I'd be getting worried about, trying to get more funds appropriated from Congress to make up for all these capital ships that are disappearing, just to replace them. How do you explain them to the members of the Congress? The fact is they don't. And that's what comes out, with these sort of leaks. One more thing I should mention before I sort of get some questions from you. In Iceland, I think it was sometime last year, a number of the people started getting telepathic messages of a landing that was supposed to take place over there. ETs were going to come down and start openly communicating with the people. Word got around naturally in the town, and it was supposed to happen in about 3 weeks hence. And of course it got around to the large military presence in that whole area. Iceland's a small country population-wise, and the military NATO bases over there get to know about this thing, it's talked about in pubs and all the rest of it. So the military obviously decided to get in on the act a day sooner, because a day before this purported landing was due to happen, which everyone was looking forward to, a massive presence of 5,000 NATO troops, mostly Americans, came aboard landing craft and occupied the whole area in the town where this event was supposed to happen. A large number of ships congregated over there. The military presence is still over there in Iceland, and these ships are still concentrated in large numbers around Iceland. for one reason or another, this ET landing didn't happen there, you know. I wonder why. So the Americans are still over there, NATO troops, and the whole North Atlantic region is, you know, a hotbed of UFO activity, as is many parts of the world, but for various reasons, as you begin to understand, it's not getting through to the newspapers and the public in general. That's why we have these conferences, and as I say, you know, I could go on a long time, but there's only sort of so much time, and time is getting up. So what I will be doing next is to show you just a 1-hour video of the talk given by a fellow called Bill Holden. He's a fellow that he was a military pilot for a while, and then he got promoted to being the chief steward of Air Force One. And Air Force One, as he explains, is any aircraft that the President of the United States happens to be flying on. It can shift from one aircraft to another, but when he's aboard that one, all the communications network and everything is aboard that craft, and he can communicate anywhere in the world to his U.S. forces anywhere. And in one of the large flights in the 60s, he was the chief steward with Kennedy, and he had developed a personal relationship with President Kennedy, and he describes that in the video. And he has some very interesting things to say, as the video will point out. You know, ferrying human crews, military personnel probably, to places in the White Sands Missile Range where landed discs were parked over there, U.S. military personnel around it, 2 grey aliens standing outside more or less welcoming crews aboard and disembarking other ones, and his job was to ferry them back by aircraft back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. These sort of things happened in 1966. He saw other weird things like these craft diving in and out of the water, as he explained this in 1966. And in describing this video, I just want to warn you that if you've got maximum volume in the video, keep it up, because the way it was recorded in Nevada in 1995, the technician had some trouble, or the equipment had some trouble, so the dB level would drop every so often, and for 2 or 3 seconds you'd have to strain to hear it, but it gets better in the second half. So you have to bear with that, and if you keep the volume way up, it'll come through. The thing I'd like to warn you about it is that the content of it is mainly the audio. It's what he has to say that's important. There are no pictures of UFOs over here. He's got some hand drawings of what he saw. But I thought I'd include this because here's a fellow who's talked with President Kennedy. He has some inside information on how Kennedy actually died. And I thought it was important to show it because if he's telling the truth and he comes over as being very sincere and has evidence, then it seems though in 1966 the American military were cooperating with alien beings and alien craft, 30 years ago. So I thought I'd show that, and then I'd show the other part where Tony Dodd speaks in England about what I telling you about before, about the North Atlantic activity with UFOs diving in and out of water and disrupting the military exercises. That'll come in the Ashfield one. So I don't know how much time I've taken on this, but that gives you, I think, enough to chew about, for you to come to the conclusion that something really powerful and maybe dangerous, or certainly very extraordinary, is happening out there, and it's been increasing over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's why I was sort of motivated to go and find out firsthand, and I came back overwhelmed because, if you've attended 100 hours by 50 different lectures by 50 different speakers, all expert in their own field of research, you get to know a heck of a lot more than I've been able to tell you tonight. So I think before we run the video, I was told I'd have time and permission to maybe take 3 questions or something, 3 or 4 from the audience, and I'll try and answer it if I can. Because okay, yeah, we'll repeat the question, and if necessary, you can come up to the microphone and ask it. Okay, any questions before we go on to the video? Yeah. Yes, the HALO project is it's one of these fast, small plane things which apparently is still on the drawing board. They're not actually flying. They're being blamed for causing some UFO sightings, but at this time the Defense Department in Britain, Ministry of Defense, is telling the truth, because the thing hasn't really been constructed yet. They haven't built a prototype. It's still on the drawing board, and people can see that it hasn't. There are other weird things going on. There are other kinds of advanced aircraft which might be causing some of the UFO sightings, but The halo one, no. I think I can answer that one, definitely.
Can you tell us what you know about the sea shadow? What you found out about that?
Yeah, the Sea Shadow is actually quite a mundane ship in the sense that it doesn't move very fast. It's designed like a stealth plane. It looks very ungainly on the water because it's just a massive hulk. It looks like a giant slug on the water. Its main mission is to detect what's going on underwater. It's got a lot of sensitive gear over there that can track things very far away in the ocean, well, beyond the horizon, with a lot of sophisticated gear. It acts as a giant communications network, and its shape is such that it will deflect radar waves. It's a stealth type technology. They used it for the shape of the thing. In other words, it can get very close to shore without being detected by coastal radar. Gets information electronically and then whiz out to sea and relay that elsewhere. Physically, it looks a bit ungainly. Propulsion-wise, there's nothing marvelous about it. But what it does, it acts as a giant communications link and intelligence gathering vehicle. Basically, that's what Sea Shadow is all about. Painted black and, pretty obvious when it's around.
Did you hear anything about its disappearance?
The Sea Shadow disappearing? Yeah, there's some vague rumors about it, but the ones that were taking more attention was the fact that American capital warships were disappearing in the North Atlantic. That was taking a lot more precedence over other rumors because that one, is still pretty new and hasn't been confirmed. But these warships one, there's more and more evidence coming from crewmen and friends and family that suffered this sort of fate. So it's the Sea Shadow.
How would you define a capital ship?
A capital ship is anything that is bigger than a frigate, I would say. A frigate is getting on for being important too because they carry guided missiles, which are useful. And capital ship usually is a destroyer type escort or, a ship which has guided missiles aboard. Yeah. Well, there's an increasing number of witnesses to suggest that they're far more intense and bigger than people can guess at. The more information that comes out of it, the more mind-boggling it becomes. A number of bases, Edwards Air Force Base, Dulce, New Mexico, Alamogordo, Edwards Air Force Base, that whole southwest region, they're all interconnected with vast tunnels that accommodate sort of like high-speed tube trains, and metro systems in Paris and London that transport personnel and material in between what are virtually underground cities. They reports of 10,000 people living over there, military people or scientists or whatever they're doing. And they go as far as 40 stories I've heard from people who supposedly worked over there, information being leaked out. Because these tunnel boring machines, if you want to dig a big tunnel, it only takes a few hours more. And they've been at it since the late 40s when nuclear power was about. In the 50s they started, 60s they've been going at it, and they keep extending it. There are big underground bases in Virginia, West Virginia, which is not far from Washington, D.C. People have seen and have evidence for that, and Richard Sauter goes into it in great detail in his book. There's sort of documentation that shows that there are even civilian contractors involved in, supplying those sort of bases. So they exist, they're real. You're going to hear that from Bill Holt in the upcoming video. There's more going on there that they want us to know about, whether it's genetics research, propulsion research. These are just hints of what's going on there. Otherwise, why build them and keep them so secret from us? The one reason is they do it is because they've got a sort of a radar now which can actually penetrate 100 feet below the surface. And in the Cold War era, they didn't want Russian spy satellites knowing what was going on in buildings and even underground buildings which were like car park level. They had to go very deep to avoid this new type of radar which can get a sense of what's underneath the ground. And that's the reason they dug them deep. There's more going on there than we can imagine at this point. I don't know all the answers. I couldn't hear that. Could you repeat?
Bases in Australia.
About the bases in Australia. Well, there's increasing number of witnesses to suggest that they're far more intense and bigger than people can guess at. The more information that comes out of it, the more mind-boggling it becomes. A number of bases, Edwards Air Force Base, Dulce, New Mexico, Alamogordo, Edwards Air Force Base, that whole southwest region, they're all interconnected with vast tunnels that accommodate personnel in between what are virtually underground cities. They go as far as 40 stories, I've heard, from people who've supposedly worked over there, military people or scientists or whatever they're doing. And they work as far as 40 stories Yeah, all I know about the bases in Australia is that they're being really important enough to stir up the Americans, who are no more concerned about the bases in Australia than what they've got in their own country. Pine Gap was mentioned all the time while I was there in Nevada, and from what people can surmise from eyewitness reports and things, you have these black C-5A transports from the Americas flying in over the Northern Territory on a daily basis at night, you know, so they're doing things over there which we don't know about. You know, the speculation ranges from electromagnetic weapons development, which there's some evidence they might be testing in the western regions of Australia right now. People have been seeing unusual lights and fireballs all the time, and there's no obvious reason or cause for them. And they could be related to secret weapon tests, electromagnetic tests, and the Americans have realized that so many international reporters and crew are just camping around Area 51 and all those regions, which are so well known now, that they decided to get some of that activity over to areas of the world which are not frequently visited by the average tourist or even the local population. And Australia is one of the best places to hide things like that. And these places are right in central Australia, you know, well removed from the Nullarbor Plain even. I mean, there's literally miles and miles of nothing around you. So it's going on in Australia, and that's the very reason why Australia is becoming more important to the whole power structure that operates the so-called New World Order. The Americans are not going to give up Australia easily, so I don't think we have much fear of being invaded, even though there's some evidence for that from the north. Pine Gap. The name of the base in New South Wales, it's one on me. No, it must have come out in the last 4 months because I was up in North America worrying about the other ones. No, I'm sorry, I don't know about that one. There are rumors that there are bases in the Blue Mountains and so forth. So some creatures have been seen to come out of there, in the Yowies and that from that region, and people see orange lights over there fairly frequently. Whether that's related to underground bases or something, I wouldn't know. It wouldn't surprise me, because if they've got the technology, they can put them anywhere for any reason they want to. So do I have more details to share about? Sorry, I didn't hear that. About the Brazilian case. Oh, the entities, they've been sort of drawn and publicized in magazines like the August or September issue of UFO magazine. It's available in newsstands in Australia, so you can get a back copy of that and see the drawings of those creatures. They're basically about 4 foot tall. They're sort of browny, oily skinned, and you can see some things like varicose veins on the back of the top part of their back and neck. They have a very sort of ugly humanoid type. It's barely really humanoid. They're sort of more insect-like face, giant bug eyes. They have 3 ribs on their head, which look like horns. And the ones that were captured seemed a bit resigned to their fate. They didn't put up a fight or anything. Some were clubbed to death, shot, and so forth, and some just gave in and captured. But that's an ongoing story, and Professor Gaviard will have more of that to talk about, no doubt, in October when he comes. So, yep. Okay, so I'll have to cut off there now, and going to show you the video. Bill Holden, he's just listen to what he says more than what he shows, because they're only drawings of things. Goes for about an hour, and I hope you'll find it interesting, and if not, the second part might be even more interesting at Ashfield next month, so hope to see some of you there and your friends. Okay, we're on to Bill Holden now. Thank you very much for attending and listening. Thank you.
Speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour.
And he said it was traveling 10,000 miles plus.
And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour.
They covered the distance from Columbus to Detroit in something like equivalent of about 20,000 miles an hour.
That's not an infrequent occurrence out there. They have them quite often.
There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time.
I have over 3,000 cases now.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
And the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge.
The size of these objects around 100 meters or greater.
So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly.
They could rise, just go straight up. They could do that, just seemed like instantaneous.
Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap.
Then it just sort of disappeared. It dematerialized.
And left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space.
It just left at high speed.
He said, "You are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened."
And you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened.
I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy.
So I was beaten, literally hitting in the ribs and pushed, and I was resisting. And I know Sergeant Bustinza was doing the same thing.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
My name is Dr. Stephen Greer. I am the director of the Disclosure Project, which is a project of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a project which we have been working on since 1992, and during this time we have identified over 400 military, intelligence, and corporate witnesses to special access projects within the United States and elsewhere that deal with what the public has called UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, and advanced energy and propulsion systems. The purpose of this executive briefing is to put together some of this witness testimony. I want to emphasize that out of the over 400 witnesses whom we have identified, that we have interviewed to date on camera approximately 100. Of those, 120 hours of videotape have been created of testimony from these witnesses. This executive summary can only contain a very small tip of the iceberg, less than 1/2% of the possible testimony which we have. But it will give you an idea of the extent of the knowledge of these men and women who have come forward heroically to tell the world, to tell our elected representatives and our scientists the truth about a subject which has been the subject of much ridicule, fantasy, and speculation for over 50 years. In addition to this, we have to consider what the risks are if we do nothing. The technologies which are in compartmented secret programs that have been derived from studying extraterrestrial technologies as well as human innovations, which deal directly with energy generation and propulsion systems, are technologies which would enable the entire planet to begin to work in an integrated function and in a way that does not lead to greater and greater spiraling gaps between the rich and the poor. Beyond this, there is something of even greater concern. One of the witnesses whom you will hear from is a person who worked directly with Wernher von Braun, the very famous rocket scientist and space explorer, who warned on his deathbed that there were people planning to put weapons in space or to have space effective weapon systems, which would be used in a hoax scenario from a threat, a hoaxed threat, that would be of extraterrestrial origin. There is no evidence that we are under any threat from any civilization from outside our solar system or within our solar system. However, there is a lot of evidence from this testimony that there are people who are deliberately trying to weaponize space under the guise of many situations which are really hoaxed scenarios. This is dangerous because if we are not alone in the universe, we cannot view space as our own private domain for Homo sapiens. We must view space as a frontier which must be shared peacefully with diverse life forms from throughout the universe. I should emphasize that this human testimony is key, and in a sense it's more important than any physical evidence because it is multiple, it is corroborating, and it can not be tossed out in a cavalier fashion. We should be very careful that we do not ignore this testimony because the testimony of these men and women serves as a significant body of evidence with corroboration of photographs and other government documents. Colonel Charles Brown is a career Air Force officer, a hero of World War II, and worked specifically in Project Grudge. This is a project which for many people didn't really exist, but it did. And his testimony not only proves its existence, but also he will state, and you will hear, how the project had definitive cases and evidence, cases that involved ground radar, air visual, and ground visual all at the same time in the same event. And as he said, it doesn't get any better than that.
Basically because of my counterintelligence training and police work in an outfit called Office of Special Investigations. Since I had one of the few pilot-trained investigators, I ended up doing a lot of investigations of unusual aircraft accidents in which sabotage was suspected. And as a consequence, became acquainted with some outstanding scientists and worked with the Air Technical Intelligence Center on a project called Grudge. At that time, Office of Special Investigations was a worldwide investigative unit in the Air Force, and were given the responsibility of investigating what became known as unidentified flying objects. And my job was to hand carry these reports over to the technical center and coordinate them with the project officer, answer any questions from an investigative viewpoint that I could assist on. Some of the objects reported were tracked on radar. We had objects with four-way confirmation: ground visual, ground radar; airborne visual, airborne radar. And so far as I'm concerned, it don't get no better than that. I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, which were far in excess of any known aircraft that we had or any of the enemies. There's no question, I've seen radar photographs of organized flights of unidentified objects, balls of light, if you will. And these were on radar, ground, visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. Now the airborne visual, strangely enough, by the time they get a couple of fighters down there, those things apparently disappeared whenever they wanted to.
Mr. John Callahan is a senior FAA official. He was third or fourth down from the top of the FAA underneath Admiral Ingram at the time in 1986 that a major UFO event happened over Alaska. He will state that these objects were indeed on radar, that they were tracked moving in extraordinary nonlinear fashion and at speeds unattainable by any conventional propulsion system, and that the CIA at a meeting with the admiral who headed up the FAA and the science advisors for President Reagan, at the end of the briefing, took all the evidence and said, quote, "This meeting never happened, this event never happened, and we were never here." I wish to emphasize that John Callahan is one of those senior government officials that people are always asking about. Where are they? Why don't they come forward? Well, Mr. Callahan has come forward, and his testimony is definitive. In addition to John Callahan's testimony, we have an enormous amount of material which he had kept from his days at the FAA as a senior official there. These include the pilot's report of the encounter, the actual videotape of the radar tracings, the FAA report which was generated, and transcripts of the air traffic controller talking to the Japan Airlines 747 captain, a military pilot, as well as subsequently a United Airlines pilot.
The way it started is there was a 747, a Japanese airline, 747, was coming from the northwest, going across the Alaskan territory. And he was at either 31, 33, or 35,000 feet. And it was, I want to say around 11 o'clock at night, but you can check the real times. He called and asked the controller if the controller had any traffic at his altitude. And the controller said no. Basically, it was a midnight operation. They didn't have too much traffic. And he said, well, something like, I have a target at my 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock position, about 8 miles. Now, in the 747, they have radar in the nose that picks up the weather outside there. So his radar is picking up a target. He sees this target with his eye, and the target, the way he described it, was a huge ball with lights running around it, and I think he said it was like 4 times as big as a 747. Well, when they read the reports that come through, the FAA has to protect themselves, so you can't say you saw a target, even though this is what he said. So they made him change his report to position symbols, which makes it sound like it wasn't really a target. The military controller has what they call height-finding radar, and they have long-range radar and short-range radar. So if they don't catch it on one of their systems, they catch it on the other. And if you listen to the military man, at one time he said, I have it on the height radar, or my range radar, whatever he called it, which indicated that he had a target on his system. The Japanese pilot would say he's now at 11 o'clock, he's now at 1 o'clock, he's now at 3 o'clock, he was bouncing around, this guy here, and when he would say that, the military guy would cut in and say he's now at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and he would confirm the position. So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles, to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly. When it was all done, and we went back to Washington the next day, the administrator had called down and wanted to know if he had a problem or not. And my boss had told him, well, we took a video of it, and it looks like there might have been something there. The administrator, which was Ingen at the time, Admiral Ingen, he said, well, have you got that video with you? Can you show me the video? And I said, yeah, and you just plug it in and play it. So we plugged it in for him. He started watching it, and after about 5 minutes, he told the staff to cancel my, he had a meeting with someone in 15 minutes. He says, first he said, I'll be late, and then next it was cancel, and then I'm going to be here till this is over. So he watched the whole thing just over half an hour. A few minutes later, the Admiral calls down and says, I set up a briefing tomorrow morning at 9 or 10 o'clock, what it was. In the round room, bring all the stuff you have, bring everybody up there, and give them whatever they want, and we want to get out of it. Just let them do whatever they want to do with it. They brought in 3 people from the FBI, 3 people from the CIA, and 3 people from Reagan's scientific study team, and I don't know who the rest of the people were. But they were all excited. When they got done, they actually swore all these other guys into that this never took place. We never had this meeting, and this was never recorded. He said this is the first time they ever had 30 minutes of radar data on a UFO, and they're all itching to get their hands into the data and to find out what it is and what really goes. And if they come out and told the American public that they ran into a UFO out there, it would cause panic across the country, so therefore you can't talk about it. And they're taking all this data. So I said, okay, take all the data. That's what you want. But they took only what we had there. They didn't ask me if there was anything else that I had. They said they're taking all this data. And I said, fine. Now, I had the original video that I took, and I had the pilot's report that came through, the first report, and I had the FAA's first report that was all downstairs on my table. They didn't ask for that, so I didn't give it to them. When they asked me what I thought, I told them that it looked like we had a UFO that was up there. The reason it wasn't on the FAA's tapes was because it was too large of an aircraft, and it was picked up as weather, so we wouldn't record it. That the pilot, the Japanese pilot, seen it. The Japanese pilot drew pictures of it. Eventually, they gave the Japanese pilot a hard time because of what he said he was embarrassing his country. Our military controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers, after a period of time, came back and said they really didn't see a target. They saw something else, which makes it sound like somebody is helping them fill out the reports, and therefore that looks suspicious. My guess is, because of the way it was, it's not part of the military's operation anymore, that it was a UFO. But who do you tell that you were involved in a UFO incident without them looking at you like you ain't wrapped too tight?
This next section of the video, of this briefing tape, is regarding the Strategic Air Command and nuclear facilities. I wish to emphasize that the witnesses we have here, again, are from diverse services. They range from the Atomic Energy Commission to people who have been at Strategic Air Command facilities and at missile launch control facilities throughout the United States and Canada. These witnesses give unmistakably clear testimony about the fact that these extraterrestrial vehicles appear to be quite concerned with our weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, more than one of these witnesses has stated to me that they believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles were there because they were very concerned that we might blow ourselves up, or that we might begin to go into space and be a threat, perhaps someday, to other civilizations. Professor Robert Jacobs is a respected professor at a major United States university who, back in the 1960s, was in the United States Air Force assigned to Vandenberg Air Force Base. His testimony is corroborated by letters and documents we have from his commanding officer, Florence Mansman. This man was present when a special photographic array photographed a testing of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And as it reached subspace, this missile was intercepted by one of these extraterrestrial vehicles and was rendered inert. This was on film. The film was confiscated. They were told to be quiet about it. And the specific frames dealing with the UFO encounter with this missile were cut out by intelligence officers and were never seen again. Again, this witness, who has tremendous credibility, has corroboration from a now deceased senior military officer and subsequently a professor at Stanford University, Florence Mansman.
They counted down the missile. We heard engine ignition, lift off. We knew the missile was underway. And we were looking down southwest, and the missile popped up through the fog. It was just beautiful. And I hollered, "There it is." And our guys on our M45 tracking mount with 180-inch lenses on it got it. And the big BU telescope swung over and got it, and we followed the thing, and sure enough, we could see all three stages of powered flight as they burned out and dropped away. And then, of course, to our naked eye, all we saw was a smoke trail going off into subspace as it headed off toward its target, which was Eniwetok Island, Eniwetok Atoll. So we whooped and shouted and heard the film wrap off in the BU telescope, and figured, well, that was our first big deal, and we got it. We sent the film back down to Vandenberg, and I don't know exactly how long it was after the event. It might have been a day or two. I was called into Major Mansman's office at the 1st Strategic Aerospace Division headquarters. And I walked into his office, and they had a screen and a 16-millimeter projector set up. There was a couch, and Major Mansman said, sit down, and there were two guys, as I recall, two guys in gray suits, civilian clothes, which was fairly unusual. And Major Mansman said, watch this, and turned on the film projector. And I watched the screen, and there was the launch from the day or two before at Big Sur. It was quite exciting because of the length of the telescope. As the Atlas missile entered the frame, we could see the whole third stage, which has two rocket nozzles like this and one in the center, a gimbaled one in the center, fill in our frame from about 160 miles. That was pretty exciting optics. We watched that stage burn out, we watched the second stage burn out, we watched the third stage burn out, and into the frame came something else. It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, which is represented by my thumb here. Now, remember, all this stuff is flying at several thousand miles an hour. So this thing fires a beam of light at the warhead, hits it, and then this thing flies up like this. Meanwhile, we're all going like this, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, we're going like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of space. The object, the points of light that we saw, the warhead and so forth, were traveling through subspace about 60 miles straight up. And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour when this thing caught up to them, flew in, flew around them, went like this, and flew back out. Everything was going about between 11 and 14,000 miles an hour that way. Now, when the lights came on, Major Mansman turned around and looked at me and said, were you guys screwing around up there? And I said, no, sir. And he said, what was that? And I said, it looks to me like we got a UFO. Major Mansman, who was a very good reader of film, said that the feeling at the time was that it must have been extraterrestrial. That they assumed that the beam of light that struck the warhead, the dummy warhead, was some sort of plasma beam, because it looked like a plasma beam. He said what happened is this. They took the film and they spooled off the part that had the UFO on it, and they took a pair of scissors and cut it off. They put that on a separate reel, they put it in their briefcase, they handed Major Mansman back the rest of the film and said, here, I don't need to remind you, Major Mansman, of the severity of a security breach. We'll consider this incident closed.
Colonel Ross Diedrichson had an illustrious career with the Air Force, which was followed by many years of service with the Atomic Energy Commission. During those years with the Atomic Energy Commission, he learned of specific incidents, not just one, but many, where these UFOs were over weapon storage areas, nuclear manufacturing facilities, as well as intercontinental ballistic missile sites. He also testifies that he learned specifically that we were planning to demonstrate our power to the Soviets by placing a nuclear missile on the moon and exploding it there, and that this missile was intercepted by extraterrestrial vehicles as it left Earth's atmosphere. This man has had a tremendous career, and we have documentation of his assignment not only in the Air Force, but at the Atomic Energy Commission. He is an elderly gentleman who is coming forward because he thinks this should be known by the world.
This is July of 1952. And of course, during that period of time, I made a lot of contacts. I was a staff officer for the military liaison committee between the chairman of the AEC and the Secretary of Defense. And so I became acquainted with not only the Army, Navy, and Air Force, but civilian agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and other contacts which I developed. During that period of time, one of my functions was to accompany a security team which visited all of the nuclear facilities to check on the security of weapons. And we were getting reports of visits by UFOs over the storage facilities and even some of the manufacturing facilities. Later, I was assigned to the Sandia Corporation as a military liaison, and I was involved in establishing a quality assurance program for the manufacture and the quality and the maintenance of the nuclear weapons. So we had to visit all of the manufacturing facilities, such as the Rocky Flats and the Pantex facility, which assembled the nuclear and non-nuclear components of the weapons. And so there again, we observed the UFOs were very much interested in the facilities that we were visiting. Almost cases where the UFOs became identified, at least on a radar or with reports, why they would try to scramble aircraft to intercept them. It was a very aggressive, you might say, response from our own government. Then I was assigned to the Unified Pacific Command under Admiral Felt during the 60s, and I was the officer in charge of the alternate command post involved in nuclear weapon operation planning. And during this period of time, I also learned of a number of incidents which happened. A couple of nuclear weapons sent into space were destroyed by the extraterrestrials. Our government sent a nuclear weapon for explosion on the moon's surface. It was tended to, as I understand it, to assess some scientific data and reaction and so forth. The idea of any explosion in space by any Earth government was not acceptable to the extraterrestrials, and that has been demonstrated over and over. And then further on, I finally retired from the Air Force and joined the Boeing Company, where I was assigned to the Minuteman program, where I was responsible for the configuration accounting of all the nuclear fleet of Minuteman 1, 2, and 3. And during that period of time, I also learned about incidents involving nuclear weapons. The one incident, for example, was they actually photographed the UFO following the missile as it climbed into space and shining a beam on it, which neutralized the missile. And this was recorded. It was all hushed up, and they split up the team that observed it, but of course eventually the news came out, and it was later published and confirmed it.
Lieutenant Colonel Arnie Arneson was present at a Strategic Air Command facility when one of these objects on radar was seen. He also learned that the intercontinental ballistic missiles were rendered inert during this and a related encounter. His testimony is corroborated by another military official, Robert Salas, who was present also at Malmstrom Air Force Base during an extraordinary event. The testimony of these two men, as well as the supporting documentation, establishes the reality of these objects and that they did have a deep concern with our nuclear facilities. In addition, they demonstrated that if necessary, they could render these intercontinental ballistic missiles inert.
I was in charge of the Communications Center at 28th Air Division at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. I was, again, the top secret control officer there. I dispatched all the nuclear launch authenticator to the SAC missile crews and whatnot, so I had a very good top secret background to go on. One night, or one day, I should say, I happened to see a message that came through my communication center. There again, I cannot quote the date, where it came from, where it was going to, but I do recall reading it and saying that basically that a UFO was seen near missile numbers, I can't recall, but it was hovering there, and it said that the crew going on duty and the crew coming off duty all saw the UFO just hovering in midair. It was a metallic circular object, and from what I understand, the missiles were all shut down. They were in the missile silos, and they were being, I don't know what SAC does as far as activating a missile is concerned, but it's basically on a standby mode, so it can be launched. But when they say it went down, it means it went dead. And something turned those missiles off, and so they could not be put in a mode of launching.
The event, the incident, I guess I call it, is happened on the morning of March 16th, 1967. As I recall, it was early in the morning, and I received a call from my topside security guard, and he said that he and some of the guards had been observing some strange lights flying around the site. It wasn't more than, well, within a few minutes, I'd say, maybe a half hour later. He calls back, and this time he's very frightened. I can tell by the tone of his voice, he's very shook up, and said, "Sir, there's a glowing red object hovering right outside the front gate." He said, "I'm looking at it right now. It's a glowing red object. I've got all the men out here with their weapons drawn." And of course, he was all shook up while he was telling me this. He was very excited. I immediately went over to my commander, who was taking a nap. We had a little cot down there in a rest period. And I was telling him about the telephone call we just received. And as I was relating this to him, our missiles started shutting down one by one. There were approximately anywhere from 6 to 8 that went down, but they went down in rapid succession, which again is extremely rare. And in the meantime, I called upstairs to find out what the status was of this object. The guard said, "Well, the object has left. It just left at high speed." Echo Flight is another squadron, about, I'd say, 50, 60 miles away from our location. But they had the same sort of thing happen. They had UFOs that were hovering, not the launch control facility, but the actual launch facilities where the missiles are actually located. They had some maintenance and security people out there at the time, and they were observed. The UFOs were observed by these people out at those sites. Now, they lost all 10 of their weapons. So that morning, we lost anywhere from, 16 to 18 ICBMs. At the same time, UFOs were in the area and were observed by airmen. This incident was of extreme concern to SAC headquarters because they couldn't explain it. Nobody could explain what happened. There is another incident that happened just within a week of this, week after, where there were radar reports and quite a few more witnesses.
So we all turned around, and they're sitting about, I'd say, a half a mile from the tower, and at about 3,000 feet was 3 silver UFOs, sitting in the farmhouse, 2 here, then 1 covering the center. Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap. And they was off our scope, and our scope would go out to 260 miles, and So that you calculate that, and that's pretty fast. I called headquarters, and the guy on the phone, and he says, I said, okay, we got a contact. And he says, you mean SAC is running a miss against you? I said, not SAC. Not SAC. What then? I said, Cosmos. He said, wait a minute. He said, scramble on your phone. So there's a switch you could throw that scrambles everything with mine. And I said, okay, my phone's scrambled. Yours scrambled, mine's scrambled. You taking pictures, taking radar pictures, taking real pictures. He says, okay, don't say another word. He says, I will send a courier up there. He'll get there in about 6 hours. You turn everything over to him. We are never officially ever noted for those pictures that they ever received those pictures. It was just went secret. It went black, like it never happened.
I was on mid-watch during my second med cruise, and it was about sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock. And I had a contact come on the radar scope. I knew the difference between surface search radar and air search radar. There's differences in polarity of the radio signal and things like this, and how the waves come back, all this stealth kind of stuff, you know, active and passive electronic countermeasures. So I know the difference between a flock of geese, or, you know, wave returns, or false echoes. In fact, this was the first thing that challenged me to check it out in ECM as to whether or not the contact I had on the scope was genuine. Because this was between 65,000 feet and above, and the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge. It was, got my attention, and the attention of others that were on watch. There were 4 enlisted on watch and 2 officers at the time. And so anyway, in this particular case, it was showing up on height-finding equipment, and it was showing up on radar equipment. And then it began to move fairly slowly at first, and then very quickly. The CO came in, and he wanted to know what the heck was going on here, and they looked at it and asked what the hell was that, you know, and it got the attention of the captain at that time. Was Captain Clark, was my captain. My commander was Commander Gibson at the time. And there was only one person on watch in ECM, and before I knew, in a matter of 15 minutes, the ship was being turned, and 2 Phantom IIs were being prepared for launch. The Phantom IIs went to afterburners, and they were about 100 miles or so away from this contact, and turned on the conical scan radar to lock on, and it winked out. Just disappeared. After they landed on 35 minutes later, and everybody's settled down, this thing winks back on again, and it's about 12 to 15 miles from the ship, hovering at about 30,000 feet. And in any event, they went out, and the lookouts couldn't see anything. Nobody could see anything. But it was there on our radar scope. It was not a false signal. And my SEAL told me, Jordan, this, you know, what have you got in your log? This never happened. And I wasn't the only one there on watch that night. So anybody who was there at that time knows what I'm talking about, and knows that it's the truth. But less than a dozen people knew what went on that night, and that ship had 5,000 men on it. There were documents that I have seen that refer to the Roosevelt having several instances of UFO flyovers, and particularly after they took on board nuclear weapons. And I was on board when they did take those on for the first time.
Merle Shane McDowell worked for the United States Navy in 1981 and had a top-secret SCI, Special Compartmented Intelligence clearance, with zebra stripes. What this means is that he was one of a few people cleared to be in the command center at the Atlantic Command Facility near Norfolk, Virginia, during very critical events, including thermonuclear war. Merle Shane McDowell's testimony establishes that an object came in off the northern North American coast was tracked on 4 or 5 radar stations. The jets were scrambled from multiple facilities to intercept and to attempt to force down this object which came from space. He will also testify that this object moved in one radar sweep from off the northern coast of North America to off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, and then down to off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. Admiral Harry Train, who was Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Command, was present during this event, witnessed it, and was involved in scrambling jets to intercept and to attempt to force down this object.
I was granted, after a 6-month wait, a top secret special compartmented intelligence clearance with a zebra stripe identification badge, which permitted access to all facilities on the base at all times. It's the highest level of alert that the Navy has or had at that time for dealing with generally dealing with global nuclear threats. When you set a condition zebra, whether it's a drill or not, people who are not authorized to be there who do not have a zebra access badge, it's a zebra stripe badge on your clearance badge, they have to leave the command facility, and we have Marines stationed outside the building there, in the building and as well as outside, that were under orders to shoot any unauthorized personnel that remained in the command center. They would announce it beforehand, this is a drill, set condition zebra. And unauthorized personnel would be escorted out of the command center if they didn't already know that they had to leave. But they turned the lights down this time and they didn't say this is a drill. There's a door right here, and this guy, the Marine, comes in and wants to know what's going on. Is this a drill or so forth? They've got orders to start shooting people. And I know because I actually got the junior OOD's attention and said, hey, you guys need to tell this guy something. He's ready to start shooting people, because they haven't told him to stand down yet, and which he did. And I remember, wanting to just get the hell out of there. We had contact with an unidentified flying object that had entered our airspace. And at that point, when Admiral Train found out that it wasn't the Soviets, and that he wanted to know were the Soviets responding to this threat also, that was the moment that he gave authorization to put 2 planes up to go see what this thing was. Pilots, you could hear the pilots' live voice transmissions being piped into the command center, visual confirmation on the object, description of the objects. Pilots were able to close a couple of times and be able to see that the object was not an aircraft that we were familiar with, was nothing that we had, was nothing the Soviets had, and that was determined very quickly. This thing absolutely had complete control of the situation and could just be wherever it wanted to be just in a matter of seconds. 1 minute we're, closing on it, off the coast of Maine. The next minute it's in Norfolk, headed south towards Florida. As Admiral Train was doing, he was scrambling, authorizing planes up just left and right, up and down the whole eastern seaboard. It headed out over the Atlantic, towards the Azores. I do remember them saying that it had pulled up at a 66-degree angle as it approached the Azores, like this, and it just pulled up at a 66-degree angle without slowing down or anything, and left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space and was gone, and just like that. The only descriptions that I recall that the pilots actually made were that they could not find any markings on the aircraft. They could not find any visible signs that the thing had wings, a tail, windows, a cockpit, or anything like that, or any markings from any country. They did get close enough to get some photographs taken that were later brought over to to the command center. Well, from the photograph, I could remember the shape. What I would have said would have been, I would say a cylinder. I would say a cylinder because it was abrupt. It had abrupt ends. The ends didn't taper down like most aircraft.
Astronaut Gordon Cooper is one of the heroes of our country. He witnessed not only a daytime UFO event in Germany, but in addition, while working and connected to the U-2 project at Edwards Air Force Base, his team had one of these objects land in broad daylight at Edwards Air Force Base. It was filmed. He oversaw this film being developed and sent to the Pentagon under special circumstances. Again, this is a hero of our country, astronaut Gordon Cooper, stating that one of these objects, a UFO, landed in the 50s at Edwards Air Force Base, and it was filmed. He saw the film, and it was sent back to the Pentagon. And his testimony cannot be contradicted because of the credibility that this great man has.
We were flying in Germany, and we were flying F-86s. And they would come over and do the same maneuvers that we make, except every once in a while one of them would go zip. And you just can't do that in a fighter, a conventional fighter. I was having some cameramen film the installation of a precision landing facility we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake. And this saucer flew right over them and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out to, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming. And he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. And so while I was going through all the regulation books and finding out the number to call in Washington to report it, I had them go over and develop a film. By the time they got back with the developed film, I was on the higher and higher and higher level officer talking to me. Finally with the colonel telling me to, when the film arrived at my desk, to put it in a carrier pouch. There would be a courier there at my office by that time already, and they'd arranged for him to fly in our base airplane back to Washington with these films. And I had a chance to hold it up to the window and look at it. It was certainly a good film. I think they're for real. I think eventually we'll find out that there's regular travel here on this Earth from other planets.
And we get quite a bit of information about the sightings. We get drawings of what the vehicles look like, whether they landed or not, whether they saw any people with them, extraterrestrials, things like that. And we would get pictures in of the supposedly AVM or satellite areas that picked up by the Soviets, what they were building sites. And once in a while, an anomaly would show up on the picture that didn't belong there. A round object, a triangular object. They were not markings put on the photograph that indicate some place or anything like that. These were above ground. They were not part of the picture.
Carl Wolf worked for the military and was at Langley Air Force Base as an Air Force technician during the 1960s. While there, and in his capacity working on some devices in a very secret area of Langley, he was shown by another technician photographs taken by the lunar orbiter prior to the lunar landing of structures on the moon that were specific, artificial, and constructed of stone and other materials. Some of them were very large, and he states are unmistakable evidence that someone had been on the moon before we landed in 1969, and that there are artificial structures on the moon.
My boss came to me. I was working in a color lab at that time. I was a technician, photographic technician. I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the lunar orbiter. And so I packed up some tools. I went over. I went into the facility. A couple of officers took me into this hangar. It was a very large hangar. So they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I saw what was going on with it. And I said to him, you know, we'll have to take this thing out of the lab if we're going to work on it. We can't work on it in here in the darkroom environment. So everyone left the facility, left the darkroom, except this airman second class and myself. And we're in, waiting for someone to come to remove this piece of equipment. And at the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation in this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. If I compare it to what I'm seeing now, because I do have photographs that have artifacts in them that are similar to what I saw, they're massive. Some of the structures are, you know, half a mile in size. So they're huge structures. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of a shape. Some of them were just very, very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut, you know, with a domed kind of, like a greenhouse. The particular shot that I saw, there were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. Do you understand what I'm saying? I would love to have looked at it longer. I would have loved to have had copies. I would love to have, you know, said more about it or discussed it more, but I knew I couldn't, and I knew that young fellow who was sharing this was really, really overstepping his bounds at that point.
They said, we were going to show you a film that might help you best put into perspective what you gentlemen have witnessed and help you maybe put it to bed a little bit for yourselves. This thing went all the way up to the space program. It showed, and I swear to God, it showed structures on the moon, these box kind of things that looked sand-colored. It showed that lunar car moving around. I remember those clearly because I remember being a child when all that was happening, but them at a distance pointing, astronauts pointing at these box-looking things, structured objects moving off the surface of the moon, filmed by definite Apollo missions.
Now, during this next section of the videotape, you will hear from people who have been involved in events where objects of extraterrestrial origin have landed or have crashed or been forced down and which have been retrieved. This is, of course, explosive testimony. It establishes the reality of the phenomenon and also of the fact that we have been studying this phenomenon for years. Many people will think that this is limited to the so-called Roswell event of the 1940s. This could not be further from the truth. In fact, there have been multiple events, at least a couple of dozen events, where objects of extraterrestrial origin have been acquired, have been retrieved, and which have been studied. We think that this is something which is of extreme importance because you cannot consider that covert programs, having spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades on research and development, so-called reverse engineering or back engineering of extraterrestrial technologies, have not had significant breakthroughs. The testimony will show that in fact we have had breakthroughs which have trickled out to our society in the form of certain advances in electronics. However, the central breakthrough dealing with the physics of the quantum vacuum space, the so-called zero-point energy phenomenon, as well as the anti-gravity electrogravitic phenomenon, that these technologies have been withheld from our society. Brigadier General Stephen Lupkin is a practicing attorney in North Carolina and a brigadier general in the Army National Guard with the JAG Division. He, as a young man, was assigned to the White House during Eisenhower's period and also at the Pentagon saw some of the material from the crash of an extraterrestrial vehicle in New Mexico. He also speaks about Eisenhower's knowledge of the subject and his great concern about the fact that there were projects and activities about which he apparently was not being informed.
We were in the basement of the Pentagon, and in those days, that was in 1959, there was a tremendous amount of security there in the basement of the Pentagon, and anybody who's worked there knows what I'm talking about. I learned a lot about Project Blue Book. Blue Book was discussed quite openly in the office. Sections of Blue Book were open for discussion, and then there were other matters as well that were brought to our attention one afternoon when we were just about ready to finish up training. It was about 3:30, maybe 3:45 in the afternoon. Colonel Hollibird brought out a piece of what appeared to be metallic. It was a metallic piece of looked like a yardstick. It had deciphering. It had the encryption on it. He did describe them as being symbols of instruction, and that's as far as he would go. But he did infer that the instructions, whatever they might have been, were something that was important enough for the military to keep working on a constant basis. It seemed giant-like when I saw it because it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this before, and all eyes were just peeled on that particular thing. And when he told us what it was, it was frightening. It was eerie. There, you could have heard a pin drop in the room when it was first mentioned. Well, he said it had been taken from one of the craft that had crashed in New Mexico, and that it had been taken from a box of materials that the military was working on. They didn't use the word reverse engineering at that time, but it was something similar to the reverse engineering that they felt like they needed to work on, and it was going to take years to do this. Extraterrestrial bodies, yes. There were either 3 or 5, and they didn't even know at that point, because some of the Some of the information that they had gotten apparently was incomplete, but 3 or 5 stands out in my mind as the number that were taken. One was alive, partially alive at the time that this happened, and I do not know what may have happened to him after that. The findings that were put in there were highly scientific, and they were highly gone over by the people that knew what they wanted to put in there. This information was information that would never get out to to anyone else, but it was designed for the use of particular military personnel. There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time. I would say there probably were between 200 and 300 cases of lock-on. And that's why those cases were in there, because they were authentic. You saw an awful lot. You saw a lot of pictures. Most of the pictures we have seen duplicates of today. Some were, the pictures that I saw were, I think, maybe a little bit better. They were taken by Air Force pilots, as well of the UFOs. Yes.
So they actually had pictures of UFOs in these.
Oh, indeed they did. Yes, not only the Air Force, but some were taken by civilian pilots. Some were taken by Marine Air Corps pilots, and some were foreign. The whole process of dealing with the UFO phenomenon could not be handled anymore by one agency, and so in order to keep it alive, and I guess as cheaply as possible, it was given to various and sundry parts of the government to work on, and I guess they thought that they could also keep the intelligence factor as secret as possible by giving little agencies a little bit here and a little bit there, and that oftentimes is done with matters like this. But what happened was Eisenhower got sold out. I think that he realized that all of a sudden this matter is going into the control of corporations. He realized that he was losing control. He realized that the phenomenon of whatever it was that we were faced with was not going to be in the best hands, and those were as far as I can remember, that was the expression that was used. It's not going to be in the best hands, and so it has turned out to be.
John Wygant is a lance corporal in the Marines. He's a young man who was very frightened to come forward, but felt that he could not remain silent anymore. In 1997, he was stationed at a secret facility in Peru when one of these extraterrestrial vehicles was apparently targeted and hit. It crashed, and he was one of the first people on site to see the device and to describe it. He has come forward even though he has been severely threatened and intimidated.
One day, Sergeant Allen and the other sergeant, and I'll remember his name soon, Sergeant Atkins. They were, and Sergeant Montalegre, and they came to us and said, "Look, you know, we got a situation where we have an aircraft crash that's possibly friendly, and they need us to go and secure the crash site." And well, we found the area really easy because there was a huge gash in the land where something had crashed. Everything was burned, and it was like if you had almost cut like a warm butter with a knife. I mean, it was just, it's like something on fire or had energy or some kind of energy, like a laser almost had like gutted. I mean, it was really strange, and basically we were the first ones to see the object. And basically what happened is we didn't go straight up the hill because basically this thing went up the hill and then off into the side of the ravine of the ridge. This is about a 200-foot ridge at least. It was buried in the side of the cliff. But anyway, we didn't go straight up. We went on to the left and walked up to the top of the ridge. And that's when we saw the craft. Basically, this is a huge ship, and 10 meters in width and about 20 meters in length. I'm just not sure. That's just an estimate from what I remember. But it was huge. I mean, it was big, man. And it was shaped like almost like between an egg and like a teardrop almost. And when I first saw it, I was scared. It scared the heck out of me. I didn't know what to do, and it was dripping this surf-like surf viscosity, this liquid. It was everywhere, all down, everywhere when we went down there because there was plants and everything. It was weird. It was a purplish green color, and it kind of like fluctuated. Like you couldn't really, when you'd look at it one time, then you look at it again, and it would it was almost like it. I don't know if it was like a lava that it was just changing, but every time you looked at it, you saw a different shade of greenish purple. It was just strange. There was one light on it that slowly went around, and the machine, I could hear it. I guess because it was still functioning, and it had like a hum to it, like a really bass, like say if you unplugged an amp from a guitar, that kind of it was really it was really deep. And it kind of fluctuated, and then finally it just cut off, and everything just seemed to stop. When I was looking at the craft, it was buried, so I could see the back of it, and there were these large vents. Well, they look like vents, sort of like a fish gill on the back. I couldn't see around the other side, and I guess I'm assuming that it was the same way on the other side. That looked like, I don't know, that could have been used for propulsion. I'm not sure. In Stinger School, they teach you about all different kinds of aircraft and stuff like that. And I knew a lot of aircraft anyway because I like reading about aircraft and data and that stuff. And well, essentially, when I saw it, I'm like, man, this is nothing that I know of. When I saw the aircraft, it had been hit by something that had took it out. This is what I think happened: is we shot it down. The Peruvians shot it down. The other guys knew it was flying. I knew that these aircraft were flying because I had been in the command center there at the radar installation, and I heard a couple women there in the Air Force talking about aircraft flying in and out of the atmosphere at Mach 10 plus. Oh, this is happening all the time. There was like 3 or 4 incidents where I was duty there that the same Air Force officer came in there to get books. The reason, I guess the reason they were taking them is they didn't want people to know that they're tracking these aircraft. I guess, I mean, again, I'm just assuming that.
Major George Filer was a Air Force intelligence officer who not only had an extraordinary encounter with a massive UFO on radar over the United Kingdom, but later, in the 1970s, while he was at the McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, came in one morning to find that an extraterrestrial biological entity had been shot and killed at Fort Dix and had come over to adjacent McGuire Air Force Base where it died and was on the tarmac. And he will testify that this life form was then picked up and taken back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
We were flying tankers over England, and London Control asked us to intercept a UFO. And we happened to be done with our refueling mission, and we accepted the assignment. We were on just over the North Sea, and they asked us to fly to the center of England. And we got about, I'm not exactly sure, 20, 30 miles out, and I got it on radar. And it was a very large return. And obviously London Control had it on their radar, and they were vectoring us to this object. And when we got about a mile from it, as a matter of fact, we were diving on the thing, and the whole aircraft was shaking. And it just took off into space at several thousand miles an hour. And this particular morning when I went into the command post, I was met by the head of the command post, and he said, "It's been a very exciting evening that we've had UFOs in the, over the McGuire all night, and that one had apparently landed or possibly crashed at Fort Dix, and that when a military policeman came upon the alien, that he had pulled out a gun and shot them." And I said, a foreigner, like, an alien? I was a little bit confused by him saying alien. He says, "No, an alien from outer space." He was very specific about the fact that an alien from outer space had been shot at Fort Dix, and that it had run away after being wounded and headed for McGuire. Now, McGuire and Fort Dix just have a fence between them, and this alien supposedly climbed the fence or went under it or whatever and got to McGuire and died out on the end of the runway. And the security police were out there and had captured the body, so to speak, and were guarding it. And he said that a C-141 from Wright-Patterson was coming in to pick up the plane. So I was like, my gosh, what's going on here? He says, "We want you to brief this at the, stand-up general briefing this morning and explain what happened to everybody." And I was like, "You want me to tell General Tom Sadler and everybody in the command post that, we captured an alien?" Almost every day I went to the photo lab, because in your briefings you have, 4 screens, and you have to keep them all, filled up with pretty pictures and so on. And there they indicated that they had taken pictures of something extraordinary. And I said, "Well, let me see them." And the sergeant was handing it to me, and his master sergeant says he can't see those. So all I know is that they had some pictures that I wasn't allowed to see. But normally, being the general's briefer, I had never been, stopped from seeing any pictures that they had previously. Now, one interesting thing is many of the key personnel on the base at that time who had a connection to with this were quickly transferred from the wing commander on down.
Sergeant Clifford Stone has worked as a specialist within various divisions of Army operations dealing with the retrieval of extraterrestrial vehicles. He recounts how he has specifically seen extraterrestrial bodies and been involved in the retrieval of materiel from more than one extraterrestrial vehicle which has been downed or which has crashed. His testimony, again, is corroborated by others, such as Colonel Corso, regarding the fact that we have indeed retrieved extraterrestrial devices and studied them within our projects.
MacArthur organized what was called the Interplanetary Phenomena Research Unit. It would later be taken over by General Marshall, and it continued all the way through to present day. Names have been changed. Records still haven't surfaced. The Army tries to state that it was not an official organization effort to try to investigate UFOs, but it was organized by a general. It bore fruit. It came to conclusions that was not popular, i.e. interplanetary spacecraft. And they continued to do exactly what they do today, and that is to be part of a multi-intelligent operation in the recovery of objects of unknown origin, particularly those that are of non-earthly origin, and to assess that information, get raw field intelligence data, and process that data into some type of useful intelligence product to disseminate to the field to those people who have a need to know, and those people that are the, shall we say, the keepers of that information. In the 1950s, the United States Air Force had an elite unit to investigate UFOs outside of Blue Book, even though Blue Book thought that that unit was working with them. They were not. This unit was initially organized as the 4602nd Air Intelligence Service Squadron. Among its peacetime missions was Operation Blue Fly. Operation Blue Fly was to recover objects of unknown origin that fell to Earth. It's very important that you remember objects that fell to Earth because we didn't have any spacecraft up there at this time. Later it would be expanded in 1957 to cover all objects of unknown or all objects of unknown origin, and it would become part of what they would call in the 1957 October time frame Project Moondust. In short, under Moondust, under Blue Fly, we have recovered alien debris, not of this Earth. You have an airplane accident. We have standard procedures on how we handle that. Those same procedures are utilized when you do a recovery or extraction of a crashed spacecraft or debris thereof. And I have to stress debris simply because these are highly advanced technical machines. There were not that many crashes. They're flawable because they are made by an intelligence that is as mortal as you and I. Us being mortal, we are subject to error. Now, the way you package the material, if it's just debris, is handled the same way you would if it was hazardous material. You took precautions. If you had a whole craft, you took very serious precautions, because while I still state they are not hostile, but you could cause some serious accidents which would result in death. We were informed that there had only been a couple of dozen, tops. That there were several in the 40s, in the early 50s. And once again, to make it perfectly clear about those events that took place there, I mean, it sounds crazy, but their guidance system, our radar wreaked havoc on it. And they had to make adjustments to their guidance systems for that.
What happened was we found out that high-power radar would interfere with their stability, because we could watch the amplifiers and stabilizers come down when it was low and slow, and radar affected them when it was low and slow.
How many bodies have been recovered? Don't know. How many crashes have occurred in which we only got debris from because they came and did their recovery before we got there? Don't know, but it has happened. It has happened. When they have problems, just like we send out a distress call, they send out a distress call, which is something that a lot of people don't allude to or don't even, it's the one question that's never asked. But here again, we think of them as something intangible, like that stuffed animal there. But they're living, breathing creatures, as mortal as you and I. They think, they have loves, they have likes, they have dislikes, they have social culture. This is so important to try to make people understand that that is the case.
This section of the briefing is regarding secrecy. How secrecy works. How have these projects worked? Some years ago, a military advisor of mine explained to me something called an unacknowledged special access project, or USAP. This is a project which, while compartmented and which requires special access, is also unacknowledged. And what that means is that no one outside of that compartmented area of operation is told about it. And it doesn't matter if the person is the President of the United States, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I have, over the past 8 years, had the responsibility, unwelcome, I might add, on my part, of having to brief a sitting CIA director on this issue, a sitting head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, an admiral who headed up the J2 position, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as other senior people within the Congress, the Senate, the United Nations, and foreign governments. I have found that for the most part, these high officials have known nothing about these compartmented special access projects which are unacknowledged and which deal with this issue. There's always been what they call the need to know. And even myself, I had a top secret crypto clearance, and I could go into areas where some commanders could not even get involved with. They can't get in there because they don't have the need to know, even though they have the same clearance as the guy that gets to go in there. So the UFO secrets can be kept secret from other people who have the same security clearance or the same level of security.
Depending on the level of the compartmentalization and the secrecy level, you have to go through a fairly significant background check. It takes between 6 months to a year to get the background checks. And then when you do that, then you generally, if you're in a very tight compartment, then you have to sign a statement that you will not divulge the existence of the project or even answer a question that could divulge the existence of the project. And it's not even on a need-to-know basis. It's on a basis of people being identified specifically to know what you're working on and directly associated with the project. If you have a covert project, the funding would come through a number of government sources, none of which would be identified to the workers. It's just that you sign a contract with the U.S. government and the funding would show up at the right place at the right time. There's a large number of covert projects that go on in the United States that none of us are ever aware of. I mean, I know people today that worked on one of the things that I worked on, that if you asked them, do you recognize this name, they would, even if I can show it to you on the internet, there's some things that have come up recently on the internet where some of the stuff that I was associated with, their names are now on the internet. They would say, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. In their 70s now. But they still absolutely would never admit that they even know what you're talking about. So you don't know. You have no idea. But it's probably larger than you think.
Somewhere along the line, they may see that material and realize there's some very highly sensitive information that would have damning effect upon the national security of the United States should it become compromised. It requires to be further protected to ensure that there is only a limited access to that information to a small number of people. So small you can put them on a list of paper or on a piece of paper and list them by name. Thus you have the special access programs. The controls that were supposed to be put on the special access programs are not there. When it comes to UFOs, the same criteria applies. The problem we have right now is that event, i.e. in the ultimate contact, where there is no longer a question about the reality of other beings in the universe coming here, that event has not taken place. Therefore, but a small nucleus within the intelligence community, numbering less than 100, and I'd suggest less than 50, control all that information. It is not subject to congressional review by the information security oversight at all. We have got to get the documentation as it exists in the government files. We have got to get it released before it ultimately comes up being destroyed. During the discussion of UFOs, the question ultimately is going to come up, can any government keep secrets, let alone the U.S. government? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. But one of the greatest weapons the intelligence community has at their disposal is a predisposition by the American people, the American politicians, and I hate to call them debunkers, but we'll call them debunkers, people who wish to try to debunk UFO information, They immediately come out, oh, we can't keep secrets, we can't keep secrets. Well, the whole situation is, yes, we can. I am prepared to state that I have been at locations where craft of unknown origin that did not originate on the face of this planet was there. I am prepared to state that while I was there, we saw living, dead bodies of entities that were not born on this planet. I am prepared to state that we had what they referred to as interfacing with those entities. I am prepared to state that the situation is they have a school to try to indoctrinate people. I never went to that school. I always refused. We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
A government is widespread, as everybody knows. I mean, it's into everybody's pockets and everybody's life all over the place, and the same thing holds true for the UFO extraterrestrial, if you want to look at it that way. But very, very few people really know the full knowledge of what's going on. It's held very tightly within black covert operations. They keep pretty much each organization an island unto itself. You don't have cross-departmentalization a lot within the program. TRW, Johnson Controls, Honeywell, all of them at some point or another became involved with the intelligence field, certain works, some of Phil Corso's early back engineering projects. If you will look into those, Atlantic Research was one of them, way back. Entities that were created out of people in the Pentagon to become a quote-unquote Beltway bandit. Received projects, grants, and monies to do certain projects that were so highly classified, there was only a top secret, but so compartmentalized that, only about 4 people would know what was going on. But as far as UFO and intelligence and extraterrestrial goes, it's right at the top. And I would say that the president has such limited knowledge of it. I know Carter did not have any knowledge whatsoever. And I worked right there with the organization, President Carter's organization. And the truth is, they have hidden things like UFO and extraterrestrial information from us for years. Not just the current era, but back before the 1900s.
Dan Salter is a retired Air Force career man, E9, Master Sergeant, who was involved in the extraterrestrial issue for many, many years. He later, after leaving the Air Force, was recruited into the super secret National Reconnaissance Organization, or NRO, during which time he worked specifically on extraterrestrial matters and the retrieval of extraterrestrial vehicles and the management of this subject. He had a cosmic top secret clearance, top secret cosmic compartmentalization, which he states no U.S. president, to his knowledge, has ever held.
There's about 38 levels above top secret. The highest is cosmic. That's, okay, I'll tell you right now, that's UFOs, aliens, and particleization. Now, like you heard a while ago, there's only probably about 25 people in the world that know things that are known at that level. No president has had that level, has ever been cleared for that level. Eisenhower was the closest. One that did not exist, it was so secret, was the NRO. You couldn't mention NRO, the National Reconnaissance Organization.
NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, basically run by the Air Force. the reconnaissance office, from my understanding of people that I've had contacts with, since I retired, has taken on a lot more responsibility, particularly towards UFO and extraterrestrial activities. Almost you could say that they picked up where Blue Book dropped off.
Eisenhower wanted somebody to be in charge. He tried the CIA director, and it didn't work. CIA was working primarily for itself. Most of the intelligence directors of the services working for themselves. So he said, I want it to be independent. I want it to be civilian. I want it to be some of our top scientists. And so it was organized under the name, the NIRO. If you're on that level, there's an organization worldwide called ACIO. That's Alien Contact Intelligence Organization. If you pay your dues and you follow the rules, you can benefit, your government is allowed to benefit from that organization's information. But we've been successful. We crashed in White Sands, New Mexico. We tracked it. We were tracking it at the time, and we were successful in damaging enough where it crashed. And yes, there were some aliens on it. Yes, we got them.
Dr. Carol Rosin is a former aerospace executive with Fairchild Industries who worked specifically for the last 4 years of his life with Wernher von Braun. During those years, she learned of what Wernher von Braun knew about this subject, and specifically that weapons in space were being planned many decades ago, and that it was all a hoax, that they would first use the excuse of the Cold War, then of terrorist rogue nations, then of an asteroid, and that the ultimate trump card that they would play would be to hoax an extraterrestrial threat to justify the weaponization of space. Wernher von Braun begged Dr. Rosin to do what she could to keep these weapons out of space because he thought it was enormously dangerous and unwise to move down that perilous path.
When I was a corporate manager of Fairchild Industries in 1974 through 77, I met the late Dr. Wernher von Braun in early 74. At that time, von Braun was dying of cancer, but he assured me that he would live a few more years in order to tell me about the game that was being played, that game being the effort to weaponize space, to control the Earth from space and space itself. Von Braun's purpose in life during the last years of his life, his dying years, was to educate the public and decision makers about why space-based weapons are a dumb, dangerous, destabilizing, too costly, unnecessary, unworkable, undesirable idea. The strategy that Wernher von Braun taught me was that first the Russians are going to be considered to be the enemy. In fact, when I met him in 74, they were the enemy, the identified enemy. We were told that they had killer satellites. We were told that they were coming to get us and control us, the dirty commies, that whole story. First, the Russians were the enemy against whom we're going to build space-based weapons. Then terrorists would be identified, and that was soon to follow. We heard a lot about terrorism. Then we were going to identify third world country crazies. We now call them nations of concern. But he said that would be the third enemy against whom we would be needing to build space-based weapons. And the next enemy was asteroids. Now, at this point, he kind of chuckled the first time he said it. Asteroids, against asteroids, we're going to build space-based weapons. So it was funny then. And the funniest one of all was against what he called aliens, extraterrestrials. That would be the final card. And over and over and over, during the 4 years that I knew him and was giving his speeches for him, he would bring up that last card. And remember, Cal, the last card is the alien card. We're going to have to build space-based weapons against aliens, and all of it, he said, is a lie. A lie. He didn't mention a timeline, but he said that it was going to be speeding up faster than anybody could possibly imagine. That the effort to put weapons in space was not only based on a lie, but would accelerate past the point of people even understanding it until it was already up there and too late. In 1977, I was at a meeting in Fairchild Industries in a conference room called the War Room. This is 1977. And they were talking about creating a war in the Gulf region when there was $25 billion in the space-based weapons program that yet had not been identified. It wasn't called the Strategic Defense Initiative, at least, until 1983. This weapons system then had obviously been going on for some time that I didn't know anything about. So I stood up in this meeting in 1977 and said, I'd like to know why we're talking about space-based weapons against these enemies. I'd like to know more about this. Would somebody tell me what this is about? Nobody answered. They went on with this meeting as though I hadn't said anything. I have concluded that it's based on a few people making a lot of money and gaining power. It's about ego. It's not about our essence and who we really are on the planet and loving each other and being at peace and cooperating, using technologies to solve problems and heal people in the planet. It isn't about that. It's about a few people who really are playing an old, dangerous, costly game for their own pocketbooks and power struggle.
The ballistic missile defense system is probably a pipe dream in the sense that if what it's designed for is that you know where it's coming from. And when we had Russia, there was a 50-50 chance that you knew about where it would be coming from. With the rogue nations we have today, it's absolutely ludicrous. In the 50s, they built a nuclear warhead that fit inside a Sparrow, AIM-7 Sparrow, which has an 8-inch diameter body. And that was a quarter-kiloton weapon. That'll fit inside any briefcase you can think of. Now, the guy may die carrying it, but he's going to die anyway, so what difference does it make? I'm far more feared of that than if beings can travel in time-space, then anything we would put in orbit as a weapon would be like going against Genghis Khan with a firecracker.
Weapons in space is still a big enigma. Black covert operations have always been trying to do something like that. When Star Wars was brought out as an idea, which was before Reagan actually, and incorporated into his administration, it became pretty much a window dressing, as one people would call it, but there was a lot of truth behind what they were trying to do. They knew the basic principle of what they wanted to do. They wanted a weapon system they could put in space that would stop a ballistic missile. That was the concept. Now, if that ballistic missile happened to be coming from another direction other than earthbound, could it do the same thing? Or was it a ballistic missile? No. Concepts were there. Ideas were there.
I have concluded that I'm fighting against the clock, that I have but a short time to try to convince people that we are moving in an avenue where we are going to militarize space. As a result of militarizing space, we are going to acquire new technology. We're going to evolve new technology that's going to lead us into interstellar travel. As a direct result, we will become a threat to them unless we spiritually grow also.
We put nuclear weapons out in space as a line of defense, and we was ready to blow them up if they started in.
I noticed the satellite's positionings. I said, now this is supposed to be a system that tracks radar anomalies on Earth, right? You know, the whole thing, the movement. Yep, that's what it does. And he says, and why are half of them pointed towards the outer space? towards the moon, towards areas that are just blank space. Well, I don't know, was the reply. He said, never thought about it. I says, well, at least half of those satellites you got up there aren't looking at Earth. I said, what are they looking for? He says, well, you got to have need to know about that. I said, I see. In other words, who's coming? He says, we don't know. About end of subject. There was a fear then that of something out there. It became a very big concern. Asteroids, UFOs, people coming from other places. Paranoia was also there within the government. You know, at certain levels, you could feel it. You knew it was happening. Would they tell the truth about it? I doubt it.
So when I hear that there's a possible threat of extraterrestrials, and I look at the history of thousands of years of possible visitations, recorded history, and when I hear now the stories of the disclosures of honest military intelligence industry people who have had experiences with UFOs, with crashes and landings, with live or dead bodies of extraterrestrial beings, people from out in the universes. And if I'm ever told that these are enemies against whom we have to build space-based weapon systems, based on my own personal experience of having worked in the military-industrial complex on weapon systems and military strategy, I'm going to know it's a lie.
Now, some would like for us to believe, would like to develop the idea that the aliens and people are our enemy now. But that's not true. There's no proof that I have ever read in any official document.
We ascertain, like, oh, are these people safe? Are these people that have come in out from outside, are they hostile? Well, if they were hostile, my own knowledge is, and feeling, I don't know about all of them, is that we could have been, with their weaponry, as it might be used, could have destroyed us a long time ago.
I have concluded that it's based on a few people making a lot of money and gaining power. It's about ego. It's not about our essence and who we really are on the planet and loving each other and being at peace and cooperating, using technology to solve problems and heal people in the planet. It isn't about that. It's about a few people who really are playing an old, dangerous, costly game for their own pocketbooks and power struggle. That's all it is. And I believe that this entire space-based weapons game is initiated right here in the United States of America. And what I hope is that with the new administration, I hope that this information that's being disclosed will allow the new administration to do what is right, which is to transform the war game into a space game, so that we use the technologies that are available, not just the spin-offs of war technology, but as direct technological applications to building a cooperative space system that will benefit the entire world.
We know that these unacknowledged special access projects have used intimidation, have used threats, and at times people have been killed to maintain this secrecy. I know that this is an extreme statement to make, but I am convinced from talking to not one, but dozens of military and intelligence men and women that this type of intimidation and threatening behavior has happened and continues to happen. I think this is something which is unacceptable in a democracy and in our society.
He told us we could not talk about this to anyone, including any of the other crews, our spouses, our family, even amongst each other. So we could not discuss this at all.
It had been discussed with me on numerous occasions. Talked about what could happen to me militarily and what could happen to me even if I discussed this as a civilian.
anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion, and I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole living in a tent checking the weather balloons.
I've made no money from this. I've got nothing but pain and suffering out of it, out of talking about it. I've been harassed at my home. This was used against me partially in losing a job once in teaching. I've had a hell of a time after I've told this story, but I continue to tell the story because I think it's important for people to understand that this sort of shit goes on in the government.
If their military personnel were to talk about this, they could be court-martialed, or at least threatened to be court-martialed, to get them to back down and to scare them. And other intimidations would be to hold their paychecks back, transfer them to other bases where a lot of people would not want to go to, like Alaska.
These two gentlemen began to question me about this event. And I remember, you know, saying to them, they were being pretty rough, you know, about it, to be honest with you. And I remember telling them, literally putting my hands up and going, "Wait a minute, fellas, I'm on your side." You know, whoa, just a minute, because they were not really nice. They were very intimidating and made it quite clear to the point that nothing that was seen, heard, or witnessed that transpired during that was to leave this building. You not to say a word to it about your co-workers and off base. You just forget everything you may have seen or heard or whatever concerned with this. It didn't happen. My logbook, I never did see that again. I know we had a new logbook the next day, a brand spanking new one to start with, and that disappeared. They gave me this document where for 5 years it was absolutely out of the question. I could not leave the country under any circumstances whatsoever. And to leave the state of Virginia, I had to contact the Roanoke office of the FBI and let them know if I just wanted to cross the state line down here to go into North Carolina or just leave the state of Virginia. I had to let the FBI know about it. And that was for 5 years after I was discharged.
I was arrested. I had all my gear taken from me by men in black camis, had no name tags. They were older men, probably in their late 30s or 40s. There were other people, I guess they were government, I don't know. They were there and they had containment suits. And then they put me on a cot that they had, and they had me cuffed with those, they had me cuffed both hands down, and then they had my legs tied together with those plastic fasteners that the police use. And they had a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, and he did not identify himself. He might have, I just don't remember. And he told me, if we just took you out in the jungle, they'd never find you out there. And I'm like, well, and I didn't want to say, I didn't want to test him to see if he'd really do that. So I said, yeah. And he's like, you got to sign these papers, and you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened. And if you tell anybody, you'll just come up missing. And he was a real abrasive, just a cynical asshole, I guess is the best way to put it.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
I would go interview people that claimed they had seen something and try to convince them they hadn't seen something, or they were, hallucinating or something. Well, if that didn't work, another team would come in and give all the threats and threaten them, their family, and so on and so forth. And they would be in charge of discrediting them and make them look foolish or so on and so forth. Now, if that didn't work, then there was another team that put an end to that problem, one way or the other. Secretary of Defense Forstall was the first real powerful known person that was eliminated because he was going to release the information. And nobody has ever paid for that crime. That crime has never been really thoroughly investigated by forces to see what happened to him. But most people know that he was thrown out the window of the hospital, and he wasn't killed by being thrown out the window, but he never got up alive.
He was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean, erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased. I said, how do you know all this? Or something to that effect. And he said, I know. He said, they'll go after not only you, he said, they'll go after your family. Now, those were his words.
And they're yelling at me, and they're hollering and cursing, and you didn't see anything, you know, and we'll do you and your whole goddamn family. And they're you know, it was basically that for about 8 or 9 hours. These guys, they're just off on their own. There's no oversight, no control. They just do whatever they want. They don't, I mean, and they're evil, man. These people are evil.
In the military, they do ridicule you, because I was ridiculed a few times. I was told I would never make Master Sergeant. I was on orders for tech, but I was told I would never make Master Sergeant if I brought this crap up again.
The pilots that had seen things and talked about it, some of them were let go. Some of them released from their flying and treated as nutcases and things like that.
Now, one of the things that I've found is that the way it's been kept secret to a big extent is the fact of through ridicule. If it always had been just top secret, I think most of the world would know about it. At times I used to carry nuclear weapons. In other words, I was mentally fit to carry nuclear weapons, but I'm not mentally fit if I see a UFO. Well, this criticism and this ridicule has, I think, done more to keep the story coming out than almost anything else.
This now brings us to the very big issue of why. Why the secrecy? Why has this been kept away from the public all these years? Many witnesses feel that in the early days, in the 30s and 40s and perhaps 50s, that there was concern for how the average person would react to this information, that perhaps society was not prepared, either on a theological basis or on a social basis, an economic basis, for this information. I will not dispute that fact. I was a child in the 50s, just born in the mid-50s, and I do not know personally what the milieu was that could have affected how people would react. I will say that this is 2001 and not 1951. And in the last half century, that argument is no longer valid. The world has seen humans walk on the moon. My uncle was one of the designers of the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. I don't believe anyone living today on this planet would be shocked to hear that there is life in the universe and that we have been visited. I do think that the reasons for secrecy evolved in the 50s up to this date, and they have much more to do with the economic order and the fact that the technologies related to these extraterrestrial vehicles, as well as human breakthroughs unrelated to these extraterrestrial vehicles, have given us energy and propulsion systems within the black budget, compartmented, unacknowledged world, which would have a significant beneficial effect for the world, but would have a deleterious short-term effect for certain special interests. I believe these special interests would include the conventional energy part of our economy, the internal combustion engines, the fossil fuel plants, gas, oil, coal, and ionizing nuclear technology related to nuclear power plants. We know that those technologies are already obsolete. I want to emphasize here that this is not a theory. We have testimony from people who have worked on these projects, within these projects. that can establish the fact that we have fully operational technologies which would enable the world to have no need for these polluting forms of energy. In conclusion, I would like to state that this is a matter of the utmost significance to the American people, but also to peoples throughout the world. We can establish now that we are not alone. It can be proven that there are technologies which could give us a new and sustainable civilization. And we are certain that the secrecy surrounding this issue constitutes a threat to the national security and to the security of the whole entire world.
This whole project of bringing this out in the open will probably take other people too. But myself, I'm 73 years old, and I've had a good life and no regrets, and I've loved this country, and I've been a Christian all my life since I was about 11 years old, and so I believe God wants this known. And I believe the cosmos wants this known.
It still bothers me that I've seen all this, I know all this, and like I'm walking around like with the answer, and nobody wants to ask the question to get the answer, and it kind of irritates me a little bit.
I truly believe that phenomena have been visiting this planet long before Project Grudge. I think there's adequate evidence of it. And the more we learn about the planet, the more we learn how little we truly know.
But you think about it, all this vast universe we have, if we're the only intelligent life here, God has sure got bad judgment.
The truth is going to come out sooner or later.
It's the discovery of the lifetime of humankind, isn't it? To find out that we're not here alone.
It's a truth that the entire world has to be informed about, and that truth is man is not alone.